more Ricks and Mortys out there than we realized, and not just in different dimensions. With all the chaos and bloodshed, you're probably a little confused by all the decoys this week. So today on WhitneyVision, we're breaking down Rick and Morty Season 5, Episode 2, Mortiplicity. This is your spoiler warning! If you haven't seen Mortiplicity yet, hit pause on this video and come back once you've hunted Mr. Always Wants to be Hunted to completion. Now, onto the breakdown. Very fittingly, Mortiplicity starts off with Rick and Morty scarfing down scrambled eggs at the dining table, announcing their plans to kill the Christian god once and for all. Honestly, I could have watched an entire episode of literally that, but of course it was just a tease, and moments later the entire Smith-Sanchez family is slaughtered by what appears to be an army of space squids. Thematically though, that's exactly what this episode is about, as it's a blood-fueled exercise in seeing varying versions of the family destroy their own creators in a decoy versus decoy smackdown. While these copies all seem to bleed, it appears the decoys mostly are mechanical creations at their core, which gives them the distinction of being different than the organic clones or dimensional variants we've seen before. And yes, we do see complex organs like brains throughout the episode, but with decoys being likened to hosts from Westworld and the robot Ava from Ex Machina, I think it's fair to say that we're dealing solely with artificial intelligence here. The premise of this episode hinges on what is described as an Asimov Cascade, which actually isn't an established term. Rick and Morty just made it up, but its etymology pretty specifically conveys exactly what happens in this episode. The first part of the term, Asimov, is referencing the prolific science fiction writer Isaac Asimov, who famously created the 3 rules of robotics in his short story collection, I, Robot. These laws are supposed to govern an AI's actions to prevent a mechanical uprising and are as follows. Firstly, a robot may not injure a human being or through inaction allow a human being to come to harm. Secondly, a robot must obey the orders given to it by human beings, except where such orders would conflict with the first law. And lastly, a robot must protect its own existence as long as such protection does not conflict with the first or second laws. Interestingly, while plenty of decoys intend to bring harm to who they think are the human originals, the first laws are never actually broken within this episode because it's just a bunch of robots blasting each other. I'm curious to know if on some deep unconscious level, these decoys knew that they weren't breaking rules 1 and 2 while following the 3rd law. The second part of Asimov Cascade, I believe, is borrowed from the term cascade failure, where a robust interconnected system of parts can quickly break down if one part fails in a manner that causes a domino effect for the rest of the system. We see this domino effect in action over the course of the episode, as the self-realization of one set of decoys inevitably leads to the whole system of decoys breaking down and defaulting to their 3rd law of self-preservation. In other words, once an AI discovers that their purpose is to die on the behalf of another AI, their only recourse for self-preservation is to destroy the AIs that are using them as bait. This in turn causes a violent cascade failure that results in the extinction of the entire network of decoys. Structurally, this is our dedicated anthology episode of the season, like Morty's Mind Blowers, Never Raking Morty, and the Interdimensional Cable episodes. Time and time again, this episode dangles different adventures in front of us, only to be crudely ripped away by subsequent decoy murder squads. We start with the egg-eating god killers, and then we move on to the decoy smiths that are hunting Mr. Always Wants to be Hunted, who, like his name suggests, always wants to be hunted. I genuinely wonder if this character was inspired by any of the writer's dogs, because seriously, this guy is Pugsley minus the heavy artillery weapons. Pug doesn't want to fetch or play tug like a normal dog, he literally just wants you to chase him in circles around the furniture in the living room. Next time he does it, I'm definitely gonna be like, yes, and how interesting do you think this will stay? My second favorite decoy plot is obviously the little taste of interdimensional cable we get. I love the time-traveling Wenwolves, but come on, you've never heard a play on the who, what, when, where werewolf thing? Don't you watch Adventure Time, Lemon Grab? I mean Morty. The Y-Wolves are a real threat to the house people. Side quest, did you notice how we got interdimensional cable jokes in both episodes so far this season? I'm starting to wonder if these will be a more common occurrence throughout the show's run to satiate our ID cable thirst without dedicating whole episodes to the concept. We also get a decoy plotline that teases info about Beth's mom Diane before Rick is interrupted with news of squid assassins, another recurring joke this season. This decoy Rick freezes another with a special code, 80085, which obviously spells boobs. Boobs. Later on, we find out that another set of decoys' freeze code is 8 =$ D, aka a big ol' penis. Just putting it out there, but I think that the decoy Rick who can't stop talking up his schlong probably has 8 == D as his freeze code. Based on how a Rick is alerted when a decoy is destroyed via his wristwatch, I think it's actually possible to trace the prime set of decoys. The first set of decoys follow a pretty linear path. The egg eaters were made by the Mr. Always Wants to Be Hunted chasers, who were made by the Italian vacationing smiths, who were made by the Wenwolf watchers. We'll call their creator Barcode Butthole Rick, who is alerted of multiple decoy deaths, so he's clearly a prolific decoy builder. He also learns that his decoys have been making multiple decoys, so it stands to reason that this inclination to make multiple decoys runs in his line. He's actually destroyed before we learn of his direct creator, so we have a gap in this family tree. But once we get past the montage of chaos, we can start tracking decoys again. When the Decoy Rebellion, aka the Cause, is attacked, it sends multiple alerts to the discarded watch of the Rick who has taken his family to hide out in Mexico. So he likely created a decoy line with a predisposition towards teamwork and peacekeeping. The Rick that kills him actually wears an armful of salvaged watches, which allows him to track multiple branches of decoys. This is the same Rick that builds the beacon and ends up being the last Rick standing in the aftermath of the battle. His warrior family is defeated by the Muppet Smiths, who are implied to be the last decoy standing. The Muppet Smiths are also likely the original set of decoys, because their death is what alerts the family who are returning from an adventure with Space Beth. Because the Rick in Space says, "Someone killed the Decoy family," with emphasis on "the," I think it's safe to say that the real Rick only built one set of decoys before adventuring into space. If this is true, I think it makes Muppet Rick's apology to Beth all that more heartwarming, because it comes from the Rick that's the closest version of the original. Also, I just want to note that it's interesting that in a broad sense, the decoys that accepted that they weren't the real deal lived the most fulfilling and purposeful lives. By removing themselves from the selfish Highlander fight for supremacy and breaking the cycle of violence, they were able to find happiness, unlike the Ricks who are more convinced that they had to be the realest Ricks and died bitterly when proven otherwise. Now the question on everyone's mind, are these Space Smiths the real deal? Honestly, that's up to interpretation. Earlier in the episode, the Italian decoy Rick says that decoys go on fun, self-contained terrestrial adventures. Terrestrial implying that decoys are bound to Earth. If this is a universal law that applies to all the lines of decoys, then yes, you can safely say that the Smiths with Space Beth are the real deal. But two major counterpoints to this. First, we do see a bunch of squids in space. Now, I will say that you can fudge the definition of terrestrial to include Earth's atmosphere, so maybe these still are following that ruling. But more damning is the second counterpoint. The whole episode is dependent on decoys breaking from their programming to build other decoys, so it isn't far-fetched to think that decoys could break their terrestrial boundaries as well. It's also entirely possible that this ruling only applies to some decoys and not all decoys. I suppose the real question is not, are these Smiths the real ones, but rather, does it even matter? It's a mind warp trying to figure out what all of these decoys mean in a world where we already have clones, dimensional doppelgangers, and even different species of Ricks, Mortys, Summers, Beths, and Jerrys. By adding even more wiggle room for the narrative to pick and choose what's actually going to factor into the serialized elements of the show, both everything and nothing we see can now be considered canon. It's Schrodinger's C-137. The writers are no longer beholden to any canon they dislike. If they want 90% of the adventures to be one-off self-contained sitcom romps with no consequences, they've added the decoy out to the alt-reality out they already had. Or if they want to explore characters and ideas further for larger narrative purposes, they can still do that as they please. What this means to me personally is that all the bleached little buttholes who commented mean degrading things on my last video about how Mort or Rick Andre might not have featured C-137 can lick my balls! Maybe I wasn't right about them being from an alt dimension, but now it's totally possible that they were decoys. Is this why that Rick seemed weaker and more vulnerable because he was technically a watered-down copy of a Rick? If all of the remaining decoys are dead, I do not want to be around when Mr. Nimbus finds out they're gone. Each thrust will be filled with so much sadness. Or maybe I am wrong. Fan theories are just fun, man. I'm not trying to pretend like I'm psychic here. I'm just talking about the what-ifs with my internet friends. So if they anger you into a frenzy, take a step back, dude. With decoys on top of clones, on top of dimensional variants, the show is clearly not taking itself too seriously. You don't have to either. Anything is fair game as long as it's funny. So, respectfully, I'm gonna keep making these videos because I think they're fun, and I don't think others should stop coming up with zany predictions either. Theories aren't written in stone. They're just fans coming together and talking about what would be cool to see. So share your thoughts and theories on this episode in the comments below. If you like our videos, make sure you like and subscribe to our channel and check out our Patreon to support us. I'm Scarlet Wit, and you're watching WhitneyVision.